Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Gender Studies, the Confessions of an Accidental Outlaw. We're here with the author, Ajuan Mance, in conversation with Ashby Combahee, and we're going to just get right into it. This book gives comic treatment to the challenges, complexities, and occasional absurdity of life at the crossroads of race, gender, and geekiness. Ajuan is a professor of African American literature at Mills College in Oakland, California, a prolific artist and writer. Her books include Living While Black from Chronicle Books and 1001 Black Men from Stack Deck Press. Her new book, which is a kid's book, is What Do Brothers Do All Day? It's her first picture book. Her illustrations and comics have also appeared in several anthologies, including Drawing Power, winner of the 2020 Eisner Award for Best Anthology. Her academic collections include Inventing Black Women and Before Harlem, both with the University of Tennessee Press. You can learn more about her online, and I'll drop the website in the chat for folks. And she's joined by Ashby Combahee, who uses she, he, or they pronouns. Ashby is a Black queer memory worker from the South. She's a full-time librarian and archivist at the Highlander Research and Education Center. Ashby has worked on numerous community oral history projects, including Georgia Dusk, a Southern Liberation oral history, the New York Public Library Community Oral History Project, Black Women's Blueprint, Truth and Reconciliation Commission Partnership, with Threshold Collaborative, the Womanist Working Collaborative, and the Georgia Transgender Oral History Project. For Ashby, preserving and engaging collective memory is vital to sustaining impactful political movements. Using oral history as a catalyst for reflection and dialogue, Ashby believes that the most impactful learning opportunities develop by interrogating our lived experiences. So when we saw this event, there was nobody that we wanted to have in conversation with you more than Ashby. So I'm really glad Ashby could be with us today. And we're glad that all of you can be with us watching from home. Thank you so much. If you want to shout out where you're watching from, you can do that in the chat. You also can ask questions at any time, so don't be shy. Put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A box at any time. But I am going to go ahead and get out of here so that we can get right into this conversation. But thank you both so much for being with us tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, ER. And thank you for being here, Charis. I always consider Charis my home away from home. And so I feel like whenever talking to an author or a guest of honor, it is like saying welcome home. So thank you for doing your book talk with me. And I'm excited because this is I felt so seen.
That's great.
I felt so seen. I mean, it's wonderful too, I think, especially because there's an intergenerational aspect, right? I'm a couple of at least a generation behind you, and there were so many shared experiences that you touched on as a Black queer woman, or someone who's especially gone through Black queer woman or Black womanhood, especially. I would love for you to tell us a little bit to start us off about what brought you to writing this book.
Oh, thanks. And thanks for being here. Everything that you do is so amazing. I love archives. I love oral histories. And so I'm just glad to be in the same space. This is wonderful.
Absolutely.
Gender studies is, I would say I'm a reluctant comic creator. I started reading comics as a kid, trying to find a way in. I mostly did the humorous comics because the superhero comics didn't really feel accessible to me. And like a lot of queer and trans comic creators I know, it was the Hernandez brothers with Love and Rockets comics that are still running, but started in the 1980s, that helped us find a way in. Someone who was drawing, it's kind of magical realist, but it's all people of color. One does Afro-Latino storyline, another is a Mexican-American storyline set in Los Angeles, and they're queer people. I mean, it was pretty amazing. And I remember thinking, I draw a lot, I do art, I should do comics, but I thought that is way too much work. And so later in life, I went to my first Comic-Con San Diego as a fan in 2010 and had been in the zine world a little bit in San Francisco and Oakland, which is where I live, and had met people there. I was doing a series of 1,001 Portraits of Black Men, and I used kind of a graphic, really stylized, almost comic style for my art and my non-comic art as well. And so I was said, I married people who said, "Oh, you should do comics. You should do comics." And I just thought, "Oh, too much work." And then eventually, over the times that I got to know more comic creators, some of them kind of broke down the process for me, just in a series of conversations. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put my toe in the water. And what I discovered with comics was that there were stories I wanted to tell in comics that I had never wanted to tell in any other form. And
Mm,
so I was hooked.
absolutely. I mean, I think I especially appreciate it being a comic, knowing the fuller body of your work. As a scholar, especially within literature, and so I imagine that this book is treated more, especially as a memoir. I'm curious what that is like for you, having had an academic writing background and moving into a comic.
That's it's interesting because there's something about memoir that is very, you feel very vulnerable putting that out into the world. And the first time I did the first issue that I ever did, gender studies, was about, what I learned from the men I dated in college, what I learned about gender before coming out as a queer woman in 1987. Um,
Mm,
and but I released that to other zine people who I already knew. And so I felt, talk about safe spaces. I felt like, I can tell all the stories about myself that I want. It was a qualitatively different experience to see this book go out into the world, especially since, as an academic writer, one of the things you do is you put yourself in your work, but in a much more, um, I suppose you could say, opaque fashion.
mm,
So you often see people doing work about some aspect of their life. I do African American literature of the
mm,
19th century, and I happen to have grown up with knowing my great grandparents who were born in the 19th century. And so I feel very connected to history. And so, in some ways, it is a form of, if not autobiography, at least exploring an aspect of my identity that's really important to me. But actually centering myself is something that was very new with the creation of comics. And, I don't know if I was a natural academic, but I'm not the kind of person who ever kept a journal. I never lasted more than 2 or 3 days before I get tired of writing about myself. Um, and something about being able to tell stories, not necessarily in sequence, but in a comic form using the visual um, and the script, the words, really made me feel free to share things about my life that I had never thought of sharing before.
yeah, yeah. I feel that vulnerability in such a way that, as I said before, I can immediately connect to it. Um, and I'm curious, this also is it's specific to your gender journey, and how gender is in connection with race. And what was it like to reflect on your gender journey through this comic?
Um, it was really fascinating. And it was almost like research. It was like using my life as the archive to go back and pull pieces together and figure out how I got to the place where I am today. I was born in the 60s, in the late 60s, and came of age in the 70s. And in some ways, the 1970s was really wild, especially for people who were adults at that time. Um, and but certainly, the earliest story I tell is from about a genderqueer person, now would be described as a genderqueer person, in my second grade class, second, third, and fourth grade, back in 1972. And what's it's been really interesting in some ways. When I first started doing stories about gender, I thought, in some ways it's easy for me to access that because it has been more of an affirming space to be gender nonconforming than a marginalizing space for me. There have been other aspects of my life that have been marginalizing. It might actually be harder to write about. Certainly I've experienced racism, particularly in academia. Um, but and certainly being a kind of a black nerd um, is marginalizing in ways that um, are probably the reason that Black nerd community is growing because people struggle to find each other. Not anymore, not with the internet. Um, but gender identity has always been actually a space where I find where it's been easy to find my people and it's been easy to fit in, and so in some ways that was one of the safest spaces to enter the realm of autobiography.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Which just, I guess, goes to show you how challenging it could be to be a Black academic.
Yeah, absolutely. While I was reading this, and there's such good storytelling there that I feel like I am transported into another time and space. And certainly the graphics help a lot. I enjoy graphic novels and comics, but I don't often read ones that are so directly connected to my lived experience. And it's kind of like when you watch television shows that feature queer folks, and I'm like, I feel seen in a way that makes me feel very uh, vulnerable and self-reflective. Um, and it also made me wonder and hear from you tonight of like, I want to know more of what it was like growing up, especially as a queer of age adult in the 80s.
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, I like it first of all because the '80s feels like yesterday to me, but it's really, really not. Um, it was an interesting time, and I think it's one of the reasons that this the that one of my comics, the first one in the book, so it's not huge. The first kind of chapter talks about my experience of, in some ways, conflating identification with masculinity with attraction to masculine cis men. Um,
Mm,
and because there were very although there was a way in which I remember coming home from school one day and MTV was showing music videos on my parents' television, and I felt like magic had happened. And there were a lot of the representation of people in the '80s, the style for cishet people, and particularly for cishet men, was what my people today would probably describe as genderqueer. A lot of makeup, um, you know, um, and a lot of kind of flowy clothing or clothing that was very, which would be considered queer by contemporary standards. Um, Even and yet, despite that, it was a very cishet normative time. And
mm,
so, as someone who found it very easy to follow rules, I was a very good student. I was always very well behaved. Um, Within, there was kind of a rule that society established. This is what you are. Everyone is cishet. And so it never, in some ways, it sounds bizarre, but it didn't really occur to me to imagine myself outside of those boundaries until I, had gone off to college and
mm,
then slowly began to encounter queer people and kind of like your experience with my book, my experience meeting, say, the women's rugby team at MIT, um, really kind of held up a mirror and I thought, wait a minute, I think that there is something more than just the rules that I am attempting to follow. And that was when I was able to finally start to um, reconfigure what felt like attraction and understand that actually it's identification.
mhm.
I identify with these people and we're going to be great friends, but that's about it.
Yeah, and you talk about that uh, really well in the book. Um, there's a particular part of the book that is my favorite, Requiem for a Hot Comb. Uh, I immediately, I mean, I didn't use hot combs, but I was the Black woman with my relaxed hair and was trying to figure out what does it mean to be in the world as a masculine being and recognizing every other masculine person did not have this relaxed hair or the straight hair. Uh, and so the first effort that I had at really shaping my gender expression started at my hair.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and you talk about that so directly.
yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting thing to think about. Especially as I watch governments across this country, state governments tearing themselves apart and finding themselves in knots over letting young people do what they want to do and what they need to do with their bodies. I, that's a very specific journey that some young people will make. But I really feel connected to those people who are wanting to be seen and to be free, because for me, um, there was this feeling that I always had that fried, dyed, and laid to the side for my hair was just not really a fit. And, I didn't have straightened hair when I was really little, but, probably starting when I was probably about 5 or 6, and it was hot comb. I didn't get a relaxer until I was about a senior in high school, as preparation. So things would be easy in college. And, that idea that who I am does not fit what I'm being asked to do with my hair uh, was just this pervasive thing that was always there for me. And I will say it was a transformative experience to walk into Squire's hair salon. I still remember it was this African American woman, Diana,
Mhm.
and she worked with me all summer. She, told me what I needed to do during the summer. So when I came back in the fall, I'd have enough hair underneath my relaxed hair to get a haircut. Um, and it was a great day. And so it in some ways that opened the floodgates for me to fully inhabit my queerness, my gender nonconformity. There's a way in which wearing that hair like a hat would not give me the space. But
Mhm.
once it was gone, I was able to really, really just be, and it was remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to remind folks who are joining us today, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I've got a couple of more questions for you, but I also want to open it up for the audience. Um, you know, Speaking about the representation that you had that gave you room to write this, and also the impact that I've had just reading it, what has been your hope of how this book will reach community?
Oh, that's a great question. It's such and the expectations have evolved along with the
Mm,
comic series because the stories in gender studies represent 10 years of making comics, um, and maybe a little bit more than that actually. No, it's about that because I made my first comic in 2014. Um, and when I first made it, I was just saying, can I do this? Can I work in this genre? And it was such a good fit. It felt really wonderful. I almost felt like putting a puzzle together in just the right way. And so now that it's out there, I hope that it I hope that other people have your experience. That this is a story that makes people feel seen, and that someone. It's not as though it's a story that's never told. One of the great things about being in the 2020s is that you do see other representations of Black gender nonconforming and trans folks um, in the media, which is terrific. But in terms, the comics realm um, is still, not as diverse as it could be, and Black people haven't had as much access to make inroads. And so, I hope that this serves either that people look at it and say, "Oh yeah, this is totally relate to this," even though it's a long time ago. Some of these stories, I feel this is relatable. Or I hope other people will look at it and say, this is putting into images and words something I felt. And so that maybe for some people, this is like cutting your hair off. And you realize, oh, yeah, this is what I've been actually feeling, but I wasn't able to put it into words. And now I see this is actually what's going on with me. And then, of course, the hope is that ever more people will start to do graphic novels, do comic short stories, and put our stories, because there are so many different ways of being a gender non-binary or genderqueer or trans Black person in the world. And so those stories need to be out there. There's no one master narrative. And so we need more voices to tell our stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really appreciate, especially the format of comics that feels, as I said before, like your style, it's so animated in a way that is engaging. It also like makes my creative spirit so excited to also doodle and try to put images to lived experiences. And so with that, I mean, what I heard was a bit of a call to action too. I'm curious, what advice might you give to a young writer, comic artist, someone who's trying to tell their story?
Um, I would say you know, do tell your story. Um, you will find, tell it, first of all, tell it for yourself. Um,
Mm-hmm.
when you put those things together, the illustrations and the writing, it's going to be this kind of alchemy that will reveal your thoughts, your experiences in ways that no other form could do. Each form has its own. If you wanted to write a song about your life, songs can tell stories in ways that comics can. But comics are just a really wonderful kind of meshing of those two modalities. So just, first tell it for yourself, but then share. Put your work out in the world. You'll find other artists. You'll find that comics community, which is so tight and so wonderful and incredibly supportive, and you will find that audience, because there are people who need to hear your stories, and they will let you know that. When I started selling my comics at Zine Fests, I'd print them up myself and then sell them there and learn how to use Square on my phone. I hoped that someone would want them. And then a wonderful thing happened. Probably the second or third Zine Fest I did, people started coming to me and saying, "Oh, I saw this in my class. Oh, my teacher had us read this," and it was remarkable. Um, I realized there were people who needed to hear this story, and there were people with whom it resonated. So we need your work. Please make it. Please put it out in the world. You don't have to be Rembrandt, or to draw it.
Yeah,
It just has to be. It has to be real. It has to be you.
absolutely. Um, I do see a question in from the audience that I actually think is a really helpful question. What other comics or books do you see yours in conversation with?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Um, I would say, well, I always want to give a shout out to Ebony Flowers Hopcomb. Um,
Mm,
you know, um, it's a collection of comic short stories about being a Black girl and then a Black woman. And, you know, and she did it. She started doing comics as a dissertation at the University of Wisconsin, and got permission to do her dissertation as a comic, which is amazing to me. But it tells raw stories, it tells really sweet stories, it tells really real stories about that intersection of gender and race, that have never really been told in comic form before. And the drawings are all in black and white. They're so evocative and so compelling and so true. So Ebony Flowers Hopcomb is a real inspiration to me. I have I grew up, not grew up, but as a young adult, I read Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For as Alison Bechdel was doing the series,
mm,
and that story of community, and watching characters grow over time was just at a time where some places had queer community, some places didn't. That series was always queer community, and so that was really amazing. And then I will also say, I have to shout out to all of the Black comic creators who are doing such interesting work out there. And I think always about John Jennings, who isn't just an amazing comic creator and an incredible illustrator, but also creates these avenues for other comic creators to share their work.
Mhm.
Um, and not all people who are as famous as John Jennings, who illustrated and created the graphic novel versions of Octavia Butler's Kindred, Parable of the Sower. I guess Parable of the Talents will be out pretty soon.
Mhm.
But also A Box of Bones is a series of horror and horror anthologies featuring Black comic creators, and they're amazing, amazing.
You are dropping some gems here, and I'm excited to build a longer book list. Thank you. As you were speaking too, it reminded me of another section of the book that I really enjoyed. That was this time traveling exercise. That as I was reading it, I was like, "Wait, what's happening?" And uh, it was such a sweet treat once I get to it, and so there's a very clear lineage I see here of Afrofuturism, and I know that nerd culture is such a big part of your community, and so I'm curious too of like what was it like to integrate that as part of the writing process.
Well, that was such a fun indulgence. And, as an academic, when I go to the archives, I'm going to do an analysis.
Mm,
But I had a residency with the San Francisco Public Library through this program called Radar, which would give you a few $100s and give you space to look through these kind of hand curated materials as queer artists of color. And so they pulled all these materials about 1980s queer and particularly lesbian culture in the Bay Area in the 80s. And I, I was a sentient being in the 80s, but I wasn't really an adult per se. And so I imagined myself now going back and observing and experiencing this queer community, which was so different in some ways than today. Just in terms of gender diversity, that was not really a thing. The notion of who counts as lesbian in the community, and so I had a lot of fun just going back and putting myself in that space and seeing it with my 21st century eyes.
Absolutely. I think also my librarian archivist heart was smiling too in that moment. And even hearing you talk back about it and understanding your own scholarly practice that has so much to do with engaging with archives, and I can sense that and feel that. And there's the same kind of excitement and curiosity that comes up when you're in the archives and the collections, and you're getting to directly engage in a community and life beyond what you are living here. And that was a really fun part of the book.
Oh, I'm glad. I loved writing that. It was super fun. I pulled an all-nighter. That's my comic thing. I at the deadline, I ended up pulling an all-nighter. I
Yeah.
pulled an all-nighter for that.
So I still am encouraging other folks if they have questions. Now is a good time. I also though was thinking about the title of of your book, and particularly Accidental Outlaw, um, which I think I had a certain reaction to that once reading it and feeling like, oh, there are some ways in which I did not follow the rules of Black womanhood uh, that made me feel like an outlaw. And I'm wondering if that's also what you were feeling.
Yeah, yeah. And when I've always been a nerd. How were you a nerd in kindergarten? But I was. Um, and so, there's some ways in which the idea of describing myself as an outlaw felt like an overstatement. Like, well, I wasn't really, pushing that many limits. I wouldn't put the tap on the teacher's chair. I wouldn't do that. But, there are some ways in which there are, for a variety of reasons, some really narrow expectations for, you know, AFAB Black people, AFAB people of any race to be. But that's not my experience. My experience is being Black, and the community of Black women has always been incredibly welcoming to me, and I love that. I feel like I give a lot of love to Black people, and I get it back. You know, I love our community. But there also is a degree to which, when I've been in environments in which everyone, the 80s, everyone's hair was just, the asymmetrical bob was just pow, just like that. And, mine was not, and also I didn't really want it to be. And, there were, the shoulder pads need to be like here, but I didn't have any of those clothes, but I didn't really want them. There are there's some ways in which when you kind of place yourself outside of a space, because it's just too uncomfortable to kind of capitulate to some of the unspoken rules, the rules that have value to people. I mean, it makes them feel more like themselves. Some of the ways of comporting yourself and presenting yourself made me feel less like myself, and that is it's when just being who you are is inherently transgressive in some fundamental ways. It does, you are in some ways an outlaw, um, unwittingly. Um, and thinking about that term, I had to think, outlaw versus resistance. I'm
Mm,
not really pushing back on how, I don't want to push back on people the way that people want to inhabit womanhood and femininity. I feel like what Black people, AFAB Black folks need, assigned female Black people need more space to be who they are, to inhabit femininity, if that's where they find themselves, or masculinity, or anything else. We need more liberation to be fully who we are. And I celebrate that. Um,
absolutely.
and, and so there's being an outlaw, there's, kind of being outside of the space, but being really happy for the people for whom that space really fits. Good. Because for, you know, most of 400 years, there was no place to be anything and to be seen in any way
Mhm.
except the way that other people wanted you to be seen.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think those words of encouragement make me really happy to hear. And a simple acknowledgement that to exist in this realm and really be full self, um, regardless of the spoken and unspoken roles, is significant. Is significant and oftentimes a challenge. So I express gratitude for you.
I mean, I'll just add that a real kind of thought leader for me around all issues related to gender has been Bell Hooks. Partly because the way that Bell Hooks wrote about graduate school felt like I'd been interviewed, even though I wasn't in grad school yet when she first wrote about it. But also the idea of feminism as gender liberation, regardless of your gender identity or your sex assigned at birth. For bell hooks, it's the term was huge. It was this huge umbrella that's I remember her essay "Feminism is for Everybody," because it was about liberation. It was about gender liberation. The places where gender is hurting you, you need to be free from that. And so, the idea I want to be able to fully inhabit my nerdy, geeky, not conforming self. And I want people who absolutely feel in their true selves when they are conforming to up to the eyeballs to have that space too. But one should not cancel the other out. And folks at the center need to make sure they don't experience my gender presentation as somehow undermining theirs, because that's not true. That's not a thing.
Yes. Yeah. I um I see another question come up, so I want to make sure we get to answer all of audience questions. CFX, what excites you about the future of comics as a genre related to queer, trans, BIPOC people?
Oh, this is my favorite question. Well, I don't know, I like the other question too because I love shouting at other writers. But this will give me another chance to shout out other writers. One of the things that's so great about comics that QT BIPOC people really, really need is that you get to tell people from the inside what your group looks like to you. Um, for most of the history of comics in the United States and in other parts of the world, not just the West, but everywhere else, comics have been used by people in power to help to make sure that the majority does not think the minority is human. I think you can absolutely point to representations of indigenous Australian people in older Australian comics, representations of Black people pretty much anywhere Black people have been not the majority. The way that Black folks have been depicted in comics as something very much other than a human being. Those caricatures of Black folks, of indigenous people, of Asian American or Asian people. Asia is a huge continent. Every ethnic group in Asia that has been depicted in European or US comics for much of the 20th century and sometimes tiptoeing into the 21st were dehumanized, were treated like human beings. And the effect of that visual medium showing people as something other than, not looking human because distorted facial features reinforce the notion that there is a normal way to be a person and there's abnormal and that is race. And so there's something so powerful when QT BIPOC people step in and say, hey, I'm taking the stage now and I'm going to show you what my group looks like to me. In effect, telling people what to see. And BIPOC people, or should I say QT POC, no, I'm trying to say LGBTQ people. LGBTQ people of all ethnicities are doing a lot of that right now. And I think about something like Maya Kobabe's Genderqueer, the most banned book in America. And one of the things I think that makes people so upset about this book, and that's never what they will say on the floor of the House of Representatives, is that that book, in some ways, it's such a sweet book, and it's a book about a family trying to understand and support their kid, but also the way that Maya draws trans folks refuses to allow the viewer to see trans folks as spectacles, as in any way that's salacious. And I see a lot of great comic reading. I think of someone like Tara Madison Avery, who is the publisher of Stack Deck Press, does the same thing in Tara's depictions of trans folks. And these are two white people. And so when you layer BIPOC identity on that, folks who go in, create a comic that refuses to let you make them a spectacle because of their race, or should I say because of their gender and sexual orientation, and also refuses to let you dehumanize them because of their race. It's doing really transgressive work. And there are some traditional novels, no pictures, that do very transgressive work too, but there's something really powerful about, in some ways, what you're doing is you're getting into people's heads and saying, now look at the world through my eyes. And once you do that, it becomes very, at least while they're inhabiting that book, very difficult to not see someone's humanity. And it's a beautiful thing. It's one of the most powerful things that comics can do.
Absolutely. Thank you. I had kind of a question very much oriented to, now that you've given us this gift, and have created a couple of different picture books, and have illustrated in anthologies. What do you feel is next for you, particularly as a comic?
Well, I will shout out Victor and William, who are the editors of We Belong, which is I think it may well be the first anthology of Black queer and trans science fiction. Victor Kearney and William O'Tyler. And they are both comic creators also, and they created this wonderful anthology, full color, beautiful drawings. I have a comic in there called the Black Pride Cookout Yankee Code in Space, It's available directly from Stack Deck Press. I encourage you to pick up the We Belong anthology and share widely. Um, I've begun to write. In fact, I've been in the last couple of days writing chapter outlines for a couple of graphic short story collections. One is autobiographical, kind of in the style of gender studies, and one is completely fictional, in the style, in some ways, of Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men. An old black man sitting on the front porch telling tall tales, but they're tall tales that have a science fiction bent to them. And so, I'm writing those, working on those scripts, and I hope those find a home and can emerge soon. Yeah.
I'm excited for that. Particularly after getting to indulge in your science fiction piece of this gender studies book. So thank you for once again adding to my reading list for the summer.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it was super fun to actually draw black queer people in outer space, and so
Mhm.
um, you know, you don't get to see that every day. So, and I will, if it's okay, I want to just shout out a couple of other books that I think might be really interesting for people to take a look at who are interested in um, either BIPOC representation or queer representation. In some ways, the kind of paradigmatic representation of BIPOC identity, it's not queer, is um, Jean Yuan Lang, or Yuan Lang, um, Luan Yang's American Born Chinese, which became a series that's very different from the book, but is pretty cool. But that book is just kind of a textbook case of refusing the human, first of all, refusing to let people dehumanize through stereotypical representations, in this case of Chinese American people, but then taking the stereotype and putting it in the center of the page so that you can't pretend you don't know what it is. Very, very powerful. And then there's another book that is, um, gosh, I hope I can remember. I know that one of the writers, it's co-authored, and I think it's Blue Delacanti and Solejo, who is a food writer, created a book called Meal, and it is a queer love story, um, but it's also an argument for non-traditional proteins and in your diet. So it does both things at the same time. And some of the main characters are people of color. And it's a really kind of a brilliant book. And so I, take a look. It's called, once again, it's called Neil, Blue Delaponte, and Soleil. And, Blue has done other comics and is an amazing artist and writer. And Soleil is a food writer who works for the San Francisco Chronicle and is actually now doing more editorial work beyond food. But that book was just such a special gem to me. I'm not giving anything away to say that once I closed that book, I wanted to say, I said to myself, well, maybe I could eat grasshoppers. So eating grasshoppers and queer love, what more could you want from the book?
What more? I love this. I'm hooked. I'm absolutely gonna add this to my Charis cart. Um, I, I wanted to make space to see no other questions, and you keep dropping these great gems. Is there anything else that you want to leave with us before I pass it back to ER?
Yeah, I would like to, just based on what I feel has been really important for me as a comics reader, as a QT pop comic reader, as well as comic creator. And that is, whenever, you know, find those, there are so many people out there who are making their work and trying to find a way into publication realm. In your city, wherever you may be, if you have the opportunity to go to zine fests or local comic fests, please do. You're going to find so many incredible artists and writers with amazing imaginations, and that's really the kind of ground floor for supporting work. Our work sometimes has trouble finding its way into mainstream publication, Partly maybe networking opportunities are not as broad. And also, not everyone always thinks that queer and, that QT stories and QT BIPOC stories are marketable. So, in as much as possible, go to those fests. They'll blow you away. Whenever I go to a zine fest or a comic fest, I walk through and I just think, wow, there are a lot of really good people here. I need to go home and practice drawing some more. That's that's the feeling I always get, and I always buy something that blows my mind.
Mm.
Um, oh, oh, that's a great question.
Yes, yes. Let me read it out loud so if folks aren't reading the chat. Yolanda asks, how do you, as the author, see aging being treated in comics, especially in LGBTQ two-spirit community?
That is such an interesting question. I was just thinking about that the other day. Partly because whenever I draw myself with white hair. Because I like to think of myself as a premature gray. But when I started doing comics, in 2014, my hair was mostly like this. And so, it was just part of drawing myself. But I think of pioneer women's comics comic creator. There was the early series, breakout series, women's comics, which was kind of an anthology series. It was mostly white women comic creators. Some of them were queer, and one of them, a comic creator called Mary Wing, about probably now it's about 7 years ago, had done a book called Old, about comics about what it is to be old, from the perspective of an aging white queer woman. Aging isn't covered very often in comics, for sure. And I think that is partly because of the presumed audience. The mainstream comics are forever young. They still seem to be kind of oriented, the big three, Marvel, DC, and Archie, the three huge companies, and they really seem to be, their audience may have a variety of ages, but the audience wants to kind of digest material that represents people who are mostly on the younger side. Um, but I think as comic creators get older, and as there's more space for telling stories that aren't necessarily about superheroes or, but more people writing from their lives. I know two or three people right now who are working on comics memoirs, and those people are all over 50, and their memoirs are going to be coming out from major publishers. And so I'm hoping that that's, starts to kind of turn the tide a little bit. And I just, I'm an English professor, so I can't help but um, mention other people's writing. So I will say, um, Cat Lang is one of my favorite comic creators. And I believe it's the book Snapdragon. It's a love story, and there are elders, queer elders, who are kind of at the center of the love story. There's also a kid there. And I would also, got to give a shout out to Bingo Love with T. Franklin, which is kind of a lifelong journey of love, and just about Black women across, diasporic women. So, they are out there doing it when no one else is. And those are all 21st century books, also.
Mhm.
Yeah, thanks for asking that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that reflection. I want to just give gratitude once more and probably a couple more times, both for putting gender studies out here in the world and for coming to Charis virtually tonight to tell us more about this. It's been a real joy getting to engage with your work and getting to learn more about you tonight. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been really great talking to you, and I'm so glad the book really resonates with you.
Absolutely. So I want to invite ER to come on to talk more about your other book.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This was a great conversation. So I just dropped the link to What Do Brothers Do All Day in the chat. And I wondered if you wanted to just say a couple words about that, because when we initially started talking about doing an event, it was for this book, because it came out at the end of 2023. And while I'm very grateful that we are getting to do gender studies, I want to make sure folks know about this book as well.
Yeah, it was so much fun to create this book. I always have loved children's picture books, and now I really love children's picture books. This book started as a zine um, that was in black and white, and it was for grown-ups. It was one of the many times in our history. When is it not a time in our history when people are kind of wondering, well, kind of weirdly curious about Black people, kind of in a safari kind of way, well, what do they do? What are they thinking? And so I decided to kind of play on Richard Scarry's What Do People Do All Day and do a book called What Do Brothers Do All Day, since, a lot of people are like, oh, there's a Black man. I wonder if he's going to eat that food. And so I put the zine together, and I was approached by children's librarians who said, this should be a book someday. And I let about 10 years go by. And then I actually had the opportunity to pitch a book to Chronicle Books, and I pitched that book. I thought about those librarians, and I said, this is my chance. And so the book really is kind of a love letter to Black people, particularly Black men, and there's some boys in the book as well, but mostly men. Just showing the kind of just, tried to kind of lovingly create brightly colored drawings of African American men just doing stuff that, going to the barbershop, playing video games, being an astronaut floating in outer space, dancing, just about being a parent. My goal was to create really rich drawings that there are very few words in the book. It's one of my favorite books to write because there are very few words. But there's something on every page, I think, that can give adult readers, but especially if you're reading with a kid, all kinds of things you can kind of point to and talk about. I use images, I use elements of digital collage as well, so that when there were three members of a church choir singing, and you can see I took some kind of antique sheet music of the Black spiritual and kind of inserted it as the kind of fabric of their gowns. And so I included elements like that to really, add hopefully some richness to the art there. It was really, really fun to make.
So we want to make sure folks, if you're thinking about the kids in your life, you can click on that link in the chat to buy that book. And if you would like to buy gender studies for yourself or for someone else, you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy that. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. So thank you so much. You can also, of course, request it for your local library. And also, this would be a great book to discuss in a book club. So maybe consider that as well. So, and also, certainly if you're in a nerd group, a self-identified nerd group, I think this would be really fun. So maybe before Comic-Con or Dragon Con in Atlanta, maybe have a little gathering and read gender studies. I think that would be really great. So thank you both so much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate it. And I hope you both stay safe and well. And we'll hopefully have you again for another Charis event.
Thank you so much. It's been great being here.
Take care.